I would appreciate it if you could show your support by liking and subscribing to the video before you start watching. You're standing on Machu Picchu at dawn, ancient stones holding the Andean chill. Mist rises from valleys like sleeping God's breath, and you can almost hear voices that once echoed through these halls. But listen closer. You might catch young girls' voices, trembling with fear and devotion, preparing for a journey they would never return from. We think we know the Inca Empire. Golden temples, sophisticated agriculture, astronomical precision. Textbooks paint them as advanced, spiritual, enlightened. But the truth is darker. Hidden beneath the gleaming facade lay a system so brutal that even Spanish conquistadors recorded their horror. Picture this. 1478, rains haven't come to Cuzco for 7 months. Sacred maize withers in terrace fields. Llamas grow thin. In temple shadows, priests make calculations sealing dozens of young girls' fates. These aren't random victims. They are chosen ones, most beautiful, most pure. Girls who spent years believing they were destined for honor, not knowing they were groomed for death. This is Capacocha. Inca human sacrifice reaching horrific expression during environmental crisis. When mountain god withheld rain, the Inca turned to their most precious offerings. Virgin girls, some as young as 6, selected for beauty and purity to be buried alive on frozen peaks. Their deaths meant to restore cosmic balance. Spanish chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon wrote that these sacrifices were so numerous that in times of great need, more than 400 children were killed in a single ceremony. In 1999, the preserved body of 15-year-old Juanita was discovered on Mount Amparo, brain tissue so well-preserved scientists detected coca and chicha, evidence she was drugged before her final journey. This wasn't mindless barbarism. This was sophisticated religious system transforming sexual purity into cosmic currency, where virginity became ultimate sacrifice to hungry gods. But why virgins? Why children? How did an empire building roads, spanning continents, come to systematize murdering its most vulnerable citizens? The Inca Empire wasn't just political. It was a theological state where every aspect of life was governed by religious beliefs centered on reciprocity with supernatural forces. The Aelu system organized communities owing labor, tribute, and ultimately lives to the empire. When God stopped giving, when rain failed, earthquakes struck, the debt became catastrophic. At Yuyaca, Argentina, 3 children were found buried at 22,100 feet, perfectly preserved by extreme cold. The 15-year-old girl had been struck with a blunt object. Most disturbing, her skull showed healing from previous injuries, suggesting she survived earlier, failed sacrifice attempts. Selection began years in advance. Quipu, record keepers using knotted string systems, maintained detailed censuses of every child in the empire, noting physical characteristics and family bloodlines. No child with even the smallest blemish could be chosen, wrote chronicler Juan Batanzos. Chosen children were removed from families and taken to Akwawasi, houses of chosen women, where they underwent years of preparation. They learned sacred songs, ritual dances, coca leaf divination. They were fed special diets, including chicha corn beer and coca leaves that would ease their passage to death. Father Cristobal de Molina documented the process. From every province, they brought the most perfect children. These children, dressed in fine clothes and adorned with gold, were made to walk from their provinces to Cuzco, a journey taking months. People would throw flower petals and weep. Hair analysis shows elevated cocaine metabolites months before death, suggesting systematic drugging producing euphoric states and reducing resistance. Children weren't just walking toward death. They were walking toward what they'd been conditioned to believe was divine transcendence. The most chilling aspect wasn't the killing itself, but how it was presented as highest honor possible. Families competed to have children selected. The Inca had transformed murder into religious privilege, death into divine appointment. But this was only the beginning. Winter 1476. Seasonal rains that nourished the Andes for centuries simply stopped. Quipu records tell a story in knots and colors. Crop yields dropped 60%. Llama herds died by thousands. Great aqueduct began cracking under relentless sun. Emperor Tupac Inca Yupanqui faced his reign's greatest crisis. Royal chronicles record his exact words. The gods have closed their eyes to our offerings. We must open them with blood. Ice core analysis confirms this drought severity. 1476 to 1479 represents one of the most severe dry periods in central Andes during the past millennium, with precipitation dropping to just 23% of normal. This wasn't temporary dry spell. This was ecological catastrophe. Chasca messenger runners carried orders throughout the empire's 4 regions, each tasked with providing quotas of perfect children. Mathematical precision was staggering. Each region required approximately 1 perfect child per 10,000 inhabitants. Among the chosen was Chuya, meaning clear in Quechua. Born in lakeside Copacabana, she was described as possessing skin like morning snow and eyes reflecting Lake Titicaca's depths. She was approximately 13 and had been fed a diet rich in maize and quinoa for 2 years prior to death. Chuya's selection illustrates the cruel paradox. Children were chosen not despite their value, but because of it. Her father was a master weaver, her mother a priestess. She represented not just individual perfection, but familial achievement and community status. Behind religious pageantry lay mathematical calculation of terrifying coldness. High Priest Willik Umo's personal quipu records the exact exchange rate. For every 50 children sacrificed, gods were expected to provide 1 month of normal rainfall. The drought required an estimated 400 sacrifices. Isotope analysis reveals that months before sacrifice, these children's diets were enriched with foods typically reserved for nobility. Llama meat, tropical fruits, cacao. They were literally being fattened for slaughter. Their last months filled with luxuries, marking them as offerings precious enough to satisfy hungry gods. As 1477 dawned with still no rain, the stage was set for the largest mass sacrifice in Inca history. Their names are lost, but voices echo an archaeological record with heartbreaking clarity. Consider La Doncella, the maiden, whose perfectly preserved body was discovered in 2004 at 22,080 feet on Mount Uayaca. CT scans revealed she was 15, 5 feet 2 inches tall, with thick black hair and over 200 braids. Her hair showed cocaine metabolite levels 20 times higher than normal, evidence of systematic drugging over months. Her story begins in a village where local officials identified her as Capacocha material when she was 12. Spanish chronicler Felipe Guaman Poma describes selection. They sought girls with faces like the full moon, skin unmarked by blemish. These children were told they'd been chosen by gods themselves. Psychological conditioning began immediately. Removed from families, these children learned that suffering was sacred, that death in service to gods represented highest honor achievable. They were taught songs. I am the chosen daughter, walking the silver path to Inti's embrace. My blood will feed the earth. My breath will call the rain. These children were given adult privileges intoxicating to young minds. They wore vicuña wool softer than silk, ate from gold vessels, were attended by servants and told they were becoming divine beings themselves. Journey to sacrifice sites could take months. during which children became focus of elaborate ceremonies. Spanish priest Cristobal de Molina recorded, "People would throw flower petals before them and weep to see such beautiful children walking toward heaven. The children themselves often smiled and waved, believing tears were tears of joy." The Lightning Girl, discovered on Mount Picu Picu, provides detailed glimpse into a victim's final hours. Brain tissue examination showed elevated alcohol and coca alkaloids, suggesting she was unconscious when placed in final position. Her stomach contained partially digested chicha and roasted corn, a ceremonial last meal. Perhaps most heartbreaking evidence comes from tiny details preserved by Andean climate. La Doncella's hands were positioned in prayer, but microphotography reveals fingernails bitten to the quick, sign of severe anxiety despite religious conditioning. The 7-year-old boy found beside her had tear stains preserved on his cheeks. Spanish conquistador Pedro Pizarro recorded interview with escaped victim. She told us children believed they were going to golden palaces where they'd live forever. They were told their families would be honored forever. That priest would remember their names in daily prayers. This psychological preparation was a calculated system ensuring compliance. The Inca understood willing victims were more valuable than reluctant ones. They had weaponized faith itself, turning devotion into tool for systematic murder. Despite months of privileged treatment, cortisol levels in mummified tissue indicate extreme psychological stress in final weeks. Their bodies knew what minds had been taught to deny. They were walking toward death, not divine transformation. By 1478, Emperor Tupac Inca Yupanqui had transformed crisis into opportunity. Capacocha's sacrifices hadn't brought rain, but they brought absolute psychological control over 12 million subjects who now understood their ruler commanded power over life and death itself. The emperor's Cuzco court had become calculated terror theater. Spanish chronicler Pedro Sarmiento described, "The Sapa Inca sat upon solid gold throne, wearing robes containing more precious metal than entire Spanish provinces. Before him, provincial governors deliver reports not in words, but in children, the most perfect offerings their regions could provide." Archaeological evidence from Coricancha Temple reveals systematic expansion of sacrifice infrastructure. Ground-penetrating radar identified 17 previously unknown chambers beneath the main courtyard, each containing human remains dated between 1476 to 1480. But it was the emperor's personal involvement transforming routine religious practice into imperial pageantry. Tupac Inca Yupanqui presided over sacrifices personally. Chronicler Juanita Betanzos recorded his words, "When I speak, mountains tremble. When I command, gods themselves obey. These children die because I will that they die." Villages were required to send representatives to witness major ceremonies in Cuzco, creating networks of traumatized observers who would return home with stories of imperial power transcending normal human limitations. During drought years, imperial expenditures on sacrifice logistics consumed 15% of the empire's total tribute income. Yet these weren't seen as expenses but investments. Each sacrifice strengthened theological foundations justifying Inca rule. Most revealing insight comes from the emperor's personal quipu, recently decoded. The record contains Tupac Inca Yupanqui's own calculation of sacrifice effectiveness. Detailed tallies correlating numbers of children killed with subsequent rainfall patterns. The emperor was treating human sacrifice as technology. Spanish conquistador Hernando Pizarro described the throne room. Walls were lined with mummified children's bodies, each dressed in gold and silver, faces painted to appear alive. The emperor told us these were his divine ambassadors. The sight was more terrifying than any battlefield. By 1479, when rains finally returned, Tupac Inca Yupanqui had overseen sacrifice of an estimated 2,000 children, numbers dwarfing casualties of European battles. But unlike military conflicts, these deaths served no strategic purpose beyond reinforcing the emperor's image as ruler whose power extended beyond the physical world. The emperor proclaimed gods had tested his devotion through extended crisis, and his unwavering commitment had finally proven worthy. Failure had been transformed into triumph, mass murder into religious vindication. But beneath the golden facade, cracks were beginning to appear. Rains returned in winter 1479, but they brought something priests hadn't anticipated: doubt. After 3 years of systematic child murder, normal weather patterns resuming created theological crisis that would undermine the entire imperial system. Provincial governors began asking uncomfortable questions. If gods required 2,000 sacrifices to end 3-year drought, what did that say about their power? If divine intervention was so costly, were gods allies or enemies? Most dangerously, if natural weather would have resumed anyway, what had all those children died for? Emperor's response was to double down on terror. Tupac Inca Yupanqui declared questioning divine what was treason punishable by death. Spanish chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon recorded mass executions of officials expressing skepticism, but corruption went deeper. Archaeological evidence reveals that by early 1480s, careful selection criteria were breaking down. Sites like Cerro El Plomo contain remains of children showing malnutrition and disease, indicators that were taken from desperate families rather than selected for physical perfection. Dr. Maria Rostworowski's study of 43 mummies shows marked decline in quality of clothing and jewelry after 1480. Where earlier sacrifices wore vicuña wool worth a year's village tribute, later victims wore coarser textiles and copper rather than gold. More disturbing was evidence of black market in sacrificial children. Spanish colonial records describe corrupt officials accepting bribes to exempt certain children while kidnapping children from families too poor to pay protection. Sacred divine selection had degenerated into predatory racket. Regional resistance began manifesting. Archaeological surveys reveal that after 1480, communities began hiding attractive children during imperial censuses. Skeletal analysis shows evidence of deliberate scarification, permanent disfigurement, disqualifying children from selection. Most dramatic evidence comes from Choqquequirau, where excavations uncovered mass grave containing 60 children, all showing violent death, but none displaying ritual preparation. Carbon dating places these deaths between 1483 to 1485, suggesting revolt by officials who chose mass murder over continued sacrifice participation. By 1485, Emperor Tupac Inca Yupanqui faced first serious challenges to his authority. Rather than reducing sacrifice scale, he ordered construction of new temple complexes specifically designed for mass human sacrifice. Most damning evidence comes from the emperor's own family compound. Excavations revealed 17 children's remains buried beneath room floors, evidence that Tupac Inca Yupanqui had begun practicing private sacrifice rituals. The empire's supreme leader had become addicted to human sacrifice. Spanish priest Diego Duran preserved chilling account. The emperor would summon beautiful children to his private chambers to watch them die. He claimed their deaths gave him visions. We knew he'd become mad, but none dared oppose a ruler commanding power of life and death. By 1490, the Inca Empire remained militarily powerful, but its moral authority had been hollowed out by 15 years of systematic child murder. Capacocha wasn't spontaneous religious fervor. It was an industrial process refined into machine for converting living children into divine currency with terrifying efficiency. Process began with quipu, record keepers whose knotted string databases contained detailed information about every child in the empire. The Inca maintained what amounted to a catalog of potential victims, tracking demographics, physical characteristics, and personality traits deemed suitable for sacrifice. When quotas were issued, provincial governors consulted records to identify candidates meeting specific criteria. Children between 6 and 15, unmarked by scars, with faces reflecting divine light. Most disturbing requirement was psychological. Officials chose children showing unusual religiosity or willingness to accept suffering. Transportation followed routes designed to maximize psychological impact. Children walked ancient roads, stopping at designated stations where they were displayed to local populations and underwent ritual purification. Spanish chronicler Bernabé Cobo documented standardized timeline. From selection to sacrifice required exactly 40 days, timed to coincide with astronomical events. Each preparation day followed prescribed rituals, gradually transforming children from human beings into divine offerings. Forensic analysis reveals systematic preparation. All sacrifice victims consumed identical diets. High-quality maize, quinoa, and llama meat, supplemented with coca leaves and chicha corn beer from regions designated as divine lands. Drugging protocol was sophisticated. Hair analysis shows cocaine concentrations increasing steadily over final months, reaching levels producing profound altered consciousness states. This was calculated chemical manipulation designed to reduce fear while heightening suggestibility. Sacrifice sites demonstrate remarkable engineering precision. Mount Yokal's summit contains stone platforms built specifically for human sacrifice, with drainage channels and preservation chambers. These were purpose-built execution facilities constructed with same expertise that created Machu Picchu. Killing methods varied but showed careful planning to minimize visible trauma. CT scans reveal many children were killed by single, precisely delivered blows causing immediate unconsciousness. Others show strangulation evidence, methods leaving bodies intact for ceremonial presentation. Bodies weren't simply buried. They became permanent fixtures in ongoing religious system. Spanish chronicler Felipe Guaman Poma described sites where mummified children were periodically removed from graves, dressed in fresh clothing, and presented food offerings as if still alive. By early 1500s, the Inca had refined human sacrifice into technology as sophisticated as their agricultural terraces. They had created training programs for administrators, standardized protocols, and quality control systems, ensuring consistent results across thousands of miles. But this mechanical efficiency contained seeds of its own destruction. Year 1532 brought the illogical crisis, revealing the ultimate futility of systematic child murder. When Francisco Pizarro's 168 men captured Emperor Atahualpa on November 16, 1532, the impossible had happened. Mortals had overpowered a divine ruler whose authority rested on his relationship with gods. Within days, messengers carried orders for immediate mass sacrifices to restore cosmic balance. Spanish chronicler Francisco de Jerez recorded, in every province, children were assembled for sacrifice. Natives believed only by offering their most precious possessions could they compel gods to free their divine emperor. Archaeological evidence confirms massive scale of this final campaign. Radiocarbon dating from 17 locations shows synchronized death dates between December 1532 and February 1533, indicating coordinated execution of hundreds of children across thousands of miles. But this time, gods didn't respond. Atahualpa remained in Spanish custody, his empire collapsing despite unprecedented offerings. For the first time, mass sacrifice had failed to produce desired supernatural intervention, creating theological crisis, shattering foundational beliefs. Spanish reaction to witnessing ceremonies provides detailed documentation precisely because it shocked even hardened conquistadors. Hernando Pizarro wrote to King Charles V, "They brought forward 50 children of remarkable beauty, dressed in clothing surpassing European nobility. Children sang as they walked toward death, believing they walked toward paradise." Spanish priest Vicente de Valverde left detailed account of understanding Inca theology. "I asked the emperor why his people killed children, expecting devil worship. Instead, he explained sophisticated theological system where human sacrifice maintained cosmic balance. The complexity was more disturbing than simple barbarism." Inca nobles' reaction to Spanish criticism revealed how completely the system had corrupted imperial culture. Chronicler Pedro Pizarro recorded conversation with high-ranking official. When we expressed horror, he seemed genuinely confused. He asked if Spanish kings didn't offer their most precious possessions to God in crisis. When we said gold and prayers, he laughed. What value is metal to beings who created all metal? Only life has true worth. Father Cristobal de Molina interviewed former participants. A former priest told me that by 1533, even devout officials had begun doubting effectiveness. They continued practice not from religious conviction, but from fear of acknowledging thousands of children had died for nothing. Last recorded Capacocha ceremony took place in 1572, when Neo-Inca resistance attempted one final supernatural appeal. Spanish forces interrupted the ceremony, finding 12 children prepared for sacrifice. This final offering's failure marked definitive end of practice that had defined Inca civilization for over a century. By 1580, human sacrifice had been completely eliminated, replaced by Spanish colonial administration viewing practice as satanic influence requiring aggressive correction. Spanish colonial administration faced unprecedented challenge, governing populations traumatized by generations of systematic child murder while claiming moral authority for their conquest. Their solution would prove almost as brutal as the system they replaced. Viceroy Francisco de Toledo commissioned comprehensive investigation of Inca sacrifice practices. His team interviewed over 400 indigenous witnesses, creating testimonies filling 17 volumes. Their findings revealed staggering scope of what they termed the devil's arithmetic. According to Toledo's investigation, the Inca Empire had systematically murdered approximately 20,000 children over its 200-year existence, with vast majority occurring during the final 60 years. This represents roughly 100 children killed annually, sacrifice rate exceeding even Mesoamerican rituals. But investigation revealed something more disturbing: systematic colonial cover-up efforts by Spanish administrators who had initially collaborated with indigenous sacrifice practices. Early records show that between 1533 to 1540, some Spanish officials had actually facilitated continued human sacrifice as method of maintaining control. Captain Hernando de Soto's correspondence describes using sacrifice threat to control indigenous laborers. When natives resist our orders, we remind them that their own priests once demanded their children's lives. Our demand for gold seemed merciful by comparison. Archaeological excavations uncovered evidence of hybrid Spanish Inca sacrifice practices. At Pasac, investigators found 3 children buried according to traditional protocols, but accompanied by Christian crosses and Spanish coins. Evidence some administrators had adopted indigenous practices while adding European symbols. Psychological impact extended far beyond immediate trauma. Dr. Catherine Julian's analysis reveals that between 1540 to 1580, birth rates in former Inca territories dropped by 60%, suggesting communities traumatized by child sacrifice had lost psychological capacity for normal family formation. Spanish missionary accounts provide disturbing insights into long-term effects. Father Jose de Arriaga described communities where parents wouldn't name children until age 10, fearing names would attract supernatural forces demanding sacrifice. Systematic child murder had created such deep psychological damage that normal parental bonding became impossible. Colonial response was systematic cultural destruction disguised as Christian salvation. Spanish authorities ordered destruction of all sacrifice records, execution of former officials, and forced conversion through methods often involving violence against children, the same demographic victimized by the Inca system. Father Bartolomé de las Casas pointed out the contradiction. We condemn natives for killing children in service to false gods, yet our own conversion methods have resulted in deaths of far more indigenous youth than their sacrifice practices ever claimed. Between 1540 to 1600, Spanish authorities executed approximately 3,000 indigenous adults for persistence in diabolical practices. Spanish had replaced systematic child murder with systematic adult murder, claiming moral superiority while perpetuating violence they condemned. Viceroy Toledo's personal diary reveals awareness that Spanish practices were creating similar trauma patterns. We had become what we sought to destroy, system maintaining power through systematic application of terror. Spanish had promised liberation from human sacrifice horror, but delivered only different systematic killing form. They had replaced one machinery of death with another, then claimed moral authority for the substitution. By 1600, the generation living through transition was largely dead, taking direct memory of how systematic child murder operated. But trauma patterns would continue influencing Andean communities for centuries. Capacocha sacrifices ended 4 centuries ago, but their echoes continue reverberating through our modern world in ways that should disturb anyone believing human civilization has fundamentally progressed beyond systematic violence against children. Consider psychological mechanisms that made Capacocha possible: systematic dehumanization through religious rhetoric, transformation of violence into sacred duty, and bureaucratic systems dispersing moral responsibility. These patterns didn't disappear. They simply found new expressions in different cultures and contexts. Modern archaeological investigations continue revealing staggering scope. In 2019, researchers discovered a previously unknown sacrifice site containing 47 children's remains, bringing confirmed victims to over 600 across 23 different sites. Each discovery reminds us that systematic child murder was an aberration. It was central organizing principle. When Dr. Johann Reinhardt examines La Doncella's perfectly preserved face, he's confronting human costs of ideological systems prioritizing abstract goals over individual lives. Her expression reflects same confusion and terror visible in photographs of child victims from more recent genocides and systematic violence campaigns. Psychological dynamics enabling ordinary Inca citizens to participate, gradual violence normalization, responsibility diffusion, and religious rhetoric justifying atrocities can be observed in modern contexts from Rwanda to Myanmar to detention centers where migrant children have been separated from families worldwide. Perhaps most disturbing is how easily sophisticated civilizations can develop systematic approaches to violence against vulnerable populations. The Inca Empire possessed advanced knowledge, rivaling contemporary Europeans. Yet this same society created industrial-scale systems for murdering children and convinced itself such practices represented spiritual advancement. Spanish colonial response offers troubling lessons about how conquering powers exploit previous atrocities to justify their own violence. By positioning themselves as liberators, Spanish authorities gained moral cover for colonial systems that ultimately killed far more indigenous people than Inca sacrifice practices ever claimed. Recent DNA analysis reveals family relationships, making deaths even more heartbreaking. Several children found at different sites were siblings, suggesting entire families lost multiple children. These genetic connections remind us that behind every statistic lie networks of human relationships destroyed by ideological systems. Trauma patterns created by systematic child sacrifice became embedded in indigenous communities and continue influencing cultural responses throughout the Andean region. Modern studies reveal higher rates of anxiety disorders and intergenerational trauma in former Inca territories. Today, as we confront systematic failures to protect children from violence in conflict zones, detention centers, or communities devastated by poverty, the Inca example offers warning and insight. Sophisticated civilizations are perfectly capable of developing systematic approaches to harming vulnerable populations when supported by religious authority and cultural normalization. Children of Capacocha died believing they served higher purpose, walking toward divine transformation. They were victims not just of individual cruelty, but of systematic ideological manipulation, convincing entire societies that child murder represented spiritual achievement. This wasn't just about religious extremism or primitive barbarism. It was about human capacity to create systems transforming moral horror into sacred duty. And even today, it still echoes in every society that finds ways to rationalize violence against children in service of abstract ideological goals. The gold and silver decorating those sacrificed children has long since tarnished, but psychological mechanisms that made their deaths possible remain as polished and dangerous as ever.